Hi, it's Jason Gordon from ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk about Martin Scorsese's latest, Flowers of the Killer Moon.
Shelf.
So here I am at the Canada International Film Festival. I'm actually in the press room. Just wrote a review, and here we are doing a video review in between two films. This is the way that it works. Out there are a bunch of boats, yachts. Flowers of the Killer Moon, story of murder, betrayal, missing Indigenous women, stuff that continues to this very day. It's a storyline that unfortunately hasn't disappeared, but this particular story and this particular narrative is one certainly undertold based on a nonfiction book. Stars Lily Gladston, Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, Jesse Plemons shows up at the end, and a bunch of other people, some of whom are Scorsese regulars and some of whom are individuals that are sort of new to the ensemble. At 80 years old, Scorsese manages in just under 3.5 hours to tell a tale that feels both epic and intimate. It plays out in ways, thanks to Thomas Schoonmaker's usually exquisite editing, in ways that always feel engaging. There are moments that frustrate because the characters are frustrating, because some of their behaviors is so egregious or so placid that you almost want to have something more modernist, but the way that it plays out is in keeping with the times and the way that actually elements are there. It is the story of the Osage individual, a particular Native American group that had been pushed west into an area that happened through portent, luck, whatever, to actually be a place of incredible petrochemical resources. Because of that, these were individuals that were actually granted wealth in a way, as one of the title cards actually shows. It was the per capita wealthiest area in United States. And because of that, you actually had indigenous that were wealthy. And because of that, you actually had incredible opportunities of exploitation of those indigenous by those that were coming in to not only extract the oil, but also extract wealth from those that were sort of nouveau riche within this community. It's because of that that underplays the central storyline about basically marrying into a system whereby the relatives would share in the wealth. But even that sort of simplifies the general narrative structure. You actually see so many of the trappings of the sort of colonialism, of the way that those that actually owned the land had actually purposely and legally purchased this land, or were forced to purchase the land after having been moved west, still nonetheless have their, in a very paternalistic way, have their money restricted by specific individuals that were there to question whatever things were actually being spent on. All of that sort of plays out in ways that I think for some might be slightly too subtle, and others might actually sort of be sort of beside the point of the general sort of crime thriller, the narrative, the general sense of betrayal that sort of takes place there. And of course, it's those elements that actually make the story. Those are the ones that actually are truly at the core of what takes place. De Niro is a beautifully complex character. It's pretty amazing. And DiCaprio plays a doofus. He plays a guy that's sort of navigating there, the sort of doing his best, where we can't always know his motivation, but his motivation is usually far less nefarious than that of his uncle, again played by the inimitable De Niro. The two of them on screen together is fantastic, and as I said, De Niro actually sort of playing subservient is pretty fantastic to actually see play out. Gladston herself is. She has a I think a challenging role, something that easily could sort of turn into something almost Madonna-like in her purity, but nonetheless you see from her not only the pain but also some of her contradictions. She's a three-dimensional realized character, and the way that plays out is actually pretty great. By the time Plemons comes in much later in the film, he's also a little bit sort of straight ahead as you see him, but you see that he's given enough space, enough scope to actually be able to navigate all those elements and actually provide a perfect contrast of competency to those that were actually were ostensibly there to protect his citizenry in Osage. It is stunningly photographed. Just some incredible shots. Either a mix of drone, helicopter, or crane. I assume drone and crane. I don't know if they use helicopter, but nonetheless, there's these sweeping aerials that and Steadicam shots through buildings that are absolutely bravura. It's like incredible cinematic stuff that you only notice because I'm sitting there like looking out for them. They're integrated beautifully into the film, and any moments that are quote unquote showy, like one of the final moments where it actually sort of rises from a central circle and rises above, are done there to actually remind you of the rhythm continuing, of the story continuing, of this not being one particular narrative that evokes so many narratives, again, that continue to this very day. It's quite extraordinary. Robbie Robertson himself of Indigenous ancestry provides a really effective score. It's actually probably more Robbie music in here than I was expecting. It's subtly dialed in, but it's done in a way that almost sounds like a mix between sound effects and score. Not dissimilar to what fellow Canadian Neil Young did for Dead Man, another extraordinary film. That's another story to talk about. But the way of actually making you feel sort of rhythmically tied through these sort of very direct elements, but never succumbing to straight up stereotype. You're never hearing anything that's sort of, unless you're supposed to hear something that falls into what you would expect for this type of score. It reminds in some ways of some of the subtle use of music that collaborator with Robbie and Peter Gabriel did in Last Temptation of Christ, but this is dialed in much more subtle ways that you could almost not pay attention to what's going on, but it's there nonetheless to actually drive the scenes together thoroughly. It is bleak, it is violent, it is challenging, its running length never feels tiring, it never feels like it overstays its welcome, and it just feels like a preposterously excellent work from a man in his 80s. It is still very much the energy of a younger filmmaker, certainly more energy than I'll ever employ, eliciting some really strong performances, some beautiful narrative unfolding. And again, I believe that the scope of both visual and time, allowing this film to be told in this way, not cut down so that you're only focusing on certain moments, allows it to breathe, allows the storyline to actually be effective. There's a couple missteps. There's a courtroom segment at the end which is a little bit overwrought, especially a truly egregious performance by Brendan Fraser. Yeah, he's got his Oscar, but I think he's terrible in this movie. John Lithgow shows up, and I mean, to have the two of them acting beside each other is almost embarrassing for Brendan. The sort of back and forth, the way that works, never truly sort of gets into something that it never elevates to a level that you almost expect. It's like it's the simplistic sort of awful that things don't necessarily work out with the same level of catharsis that you might necessarily want from this sort of story, that you're expecting the ending to be something bigger than it is. It's not, but it's because it's true. And that takes nothing away from the real tragedy at the heart of it, but the also resilience of those whose stories this was to tell. There are questions inevitably about whether Scorsese is the person to tell this story. I'll leave that to others to address or answer. For me, this seems that he has so clearly allowed those who participate on screen, Indigenous and otherwise, to fully inhabit these characters, to portray these stories, and to portray this culture in ways that I think is never either simplistic or infantilizing. It truly provides a dimensional aspect of this very unique period of time, a remarkable period of time, sort of post-World War I. This is a town of Model Ts where you think of gangsters, especially as something like De Niro, you're thinking of something like his Capone character, but set in a West. So it's a collision between a Western and almost a Chicago-style mob thriller, but also with little elements of things like There Will Be Blood sort of added in there, all coming together in a film that may not entirely be everyone's taste, might not be the complete home run, of the great masterworks of Scorsese's incredible work, but certainly at top tier, certainly something exceptional, and certainly a remarkable ability to tell a story like this in today's day and age, where something like $200 million was spent on something which is not a comic book movie, which is not a franchise, which is not based on pre-existing IP, but tells a story which is incredibly important. I strongly encourage everybody to give this a shot, ideally on the big screen. Paramount is contributing to its release. Apple's committed to it actually being cinematic. This is a cinematic in scope thing, and I know many people will watch it in ways much smaller, much more diminished, but nonetheless, I encourage you strongly to give this a shot in theaters with an audience, hopefully a receptive one, and I think you get something really, truly rewarding out of the experience. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on social media, and we will see you next video. More to come from Cannes. All the best.